In the hidden world of American crime gangs, where violence was power and fear earned respect, one man was different, not just because he was tough or smart, but because of something very unusual. He was incredibly handsome. People called him Joe Adonis, named after the Greek god of beauty. With his perfectly shaped face, neatly combed dark hair, and custom-made suits that fit him perfectly, he looked more like a movie star than a Brooklyn criminal. But don't be fooled. Behind that handsome face was one of the most powerful criminals in American history. A man who was there when the modern mafia was created. A man who controlled huge gambling businesses, labor crimes, and government corruption. A man who worked alongside Lucky Luciano, Meyer Lansky, and Frank Costello as they changed organized crime from old-world revenge killings into American big business. Here's what makes his story truly amazing. Even though he ran criminal businesses worth millions of dollars for decades, even though he helped create the National Crime Organization, even though he was one of the most powerful gangsters in America, Joe Adonis never spent a single day in prison for his criminal work. He was, in many ways, the untouchable criminal. But good looks can trick you, and this criminal story would not end in blood. Not in the spray of bullets that killed so many of his partners, but in something perhaps sadder: exile. A man who built an American empire was forced to watch it fall apart from across the ocean, dying in a foreign country in the land where he was born. A stranger in what should have been his home country. This is the story of Giuseppe Antonio Dodo, the boy from a small Italian village who became Joe Adonis, one of America's most powerful and mysterious gangsters. Welcome everyone to what might be one of the most interesting stories in the history of American organized crime. Before we begin this journey through the life of Joe Adonis, I'd love to know where you're watching from and what time it is there. Drop a comment below and let me know if you're getting ready for bed or just starting your day. If you enjoy deep dives into true crime history, real gangster stories told with lots of details, please hit that subscribe button. Give this video a like and share it with anyone who loves this time period of American history. Now get comfortable, adjust your pillows, turn down the lights. Let the world fade away for the next few hours. I'm going to take you through the complete life of Joe Adonis. From the dusty streets of a small Italian village to the top of American organized crime, and finally to his lonely exile. Let's begin, November 22, 1902. In the small village of Montemarano, tucked away in the mountains of southern Italy's Campania region, a child was born who would one day help change American organized crime. His parents named him Giuseppe Antonio Dodo. The village where he was born was very old. Its stone buildings had been worn down by hundreds of years. Its narrow streets wound between houses that seemed to grow from the hillside itself. Montemarano was a place that time seemed to have forgotten. The Industrial Revolution that was changing Northern Europe and America felt far away here. Life moved to patterns set hundreds of years ago. The seasons, the harvests, the holidays of the Catholic Church. The Dodo family, like most families in the village, was neither rich nor poor. They survived as their ancestors had survived, through hard work and close family connections. But by the early 20th century, Montemarano, like much of southern Italy, was losing its people, poverty, few opportunities, and the promise of America pulled young men and families away like a wave that never came back. The stories that came back, of streets supposedly covered with gold, of chances to build something, to become someone. These stories captured the imagination of a whole generation. Giuseppe's father, like so many Italian men of his time, made the decision to leave. The exact year is different in different records, but most historians think the Dodo family left Italy sometime around 1909 or 1910, when young Giuseppe would have been about 7 or 8 years old. Some records suggest the family may have come even earlier, perhaps as early as 1907. Imagine the journey for a young boy. First, the long trip from the mountain village to Naples, probably by cart or on foot. The only home he'd ever known getting smaller behind him than Naples itself, a huge, crazy port city unlike anything in his small village experience. The noise, the crowds, the forest of ship masts in the harbor, the mixture of languages and dialects. Then came the ship. For poor immigrants, this meant steerage. The cheapest space deep in the ship's belly. Families crowded together in spaces barely fit for cargo, sharing beds, breathing stale air, eating whatever food they could afford or whatever the ship gave them. The trip across the Atlantic Ocean took weeks, weeks of rolling seas, of seasickness, of fear and excitement mixed together, and then, after what must have seemed like forever to a young boy, the Statue of Liberty, Ellis Island, the great sorting place of American immigration, where inspectors poked and checked, asked questions through translators, stamped papers, changed names, and decided who would enter and who would be sent back. The Dodo family passed through. Giuseppe Antonio Dodo was now in America. The Dodo family settled in Brooklyn, in one of the crowded Italian immigrant neighborhoods that had sprung up like transplanted villages from the old country. Most likely they ended up in the area around Brooklyn's waterfront, neighborhoods like Red Hook, Carroll Gardens, or what would become known as South Brooklyn. These neighborhoods were Italy transported. The language on the street was Italian, or more accurately, a mixture of Italian dialects, mainly Sicilian and Neapolitan. The smells from the apartments were Italian cooking. The social structures were Italian. Families looked after their own. Arguments were settled within the group, and outsiders, especially Irish cops and American officials, were viewed with suspicion. For the Dodo family, as for most immigrant families, life in America meant work, hard, often dangerous work. Giuseppe's father likely found a job on the Brooklyn waterfront, in construction or in one of the factories that ran on immigrant labor. The pay was low, the hours long, the conditions harsh. But it was still better than what they'd left behind in Montemerano. Young Giuseppe attended school. At least for a while, he learned English, though he'd never completely lose his Italian accent. He learned the streets, the unwritten rules of the neighborhood, where the boundaries were, who to show respect to, who to avoid. But perhaps most importantly, he learned something about America that wasn't in the school books, that the official rules and the real rules were often very different things, that police could be bought, that politicians answered to money, that violence, properly used, opened doors that were officially closed, that in this new world, if you were smart and tough and ruthless enough, you could become something your father and grandfather never could have imagined. By his early teenage years, Giuseppe was running with the street gangs that controlled the Italian neighborhoods. These weren't yet the organized criminal groups they would become. They were loose collections of young men, many of them immigrants or first-generation Americans, who banded together for protection, excitement, and profit. The crime started small: petty theft, shaking down local shop owners for protection money, stealing from trucks, stealing from the waterfront. But these small-time operations were training grounds, proving grounds where young men learned the skills they'd need for bigger operations. Giuseppe was good at it, better than good. He was a natural. He had a quality that would help him throughout his criminal career. He was smart enough to know when to be violent and when to be charming, when to push and when to wait, when to lead and when to follow. And he had that face. Even as a teenager, he was very handsome, which gave him an advantage in a world where most of his friends looked like what they were: thugs. The nickname came early. Some accounts say it was his own idea, a bit of vanity that fit his personality. Others suggest his fellow gang members gave it to him, half making fun of and half admiring his good looks. Either way, Giuseppe Antonio Dodo became Joe Adonis, and the name stuck, in a world of men called Scarface and Three Finger Brown. Being named after a god of beauty was certainly different. The most important relationship in Joe Adonis's criminal career, and perhaps in the history of American organized crime, began in these early years, somewhere in the mid to late 1910s. The teenage Joe Adonis met Charles Luciano, another young Italian immigrant trying to make his way in the Brooklyn underworld. Luciano, born Salvatore Lucania in Sicily in 1897, was about 5 years older than Adonis. He'd come to America with his family in 1906, settling in Manhattan's Lower East Side. By the time he met Adonis, Luciano was already developing the traits that would make him legendary: intelligence, ambition, and a willingness to work with anyone Italian, Jewish, Irish, if it made business sense. The friendship between Adonis and Luciano would last their entire lives. They weren't just criminal partners, they were genuinely close, united by similar backgrounds, similar goals, and a shared vision of what organized crime could become. Through Luciano, Adonis began to meet other rising figures in the New York underworld. Meyer Lansky, the brilliant Jewish gangster who would become the mob's financial genius. Benjamin Bugsy Siegel, Lansky's partner and the handsome, violent wild card of the group. Frank Costello, the smooth political fixer who would become one of the most powerful mobsters in America. These weren't just friendships. They were alliances being formed that would reshape American crime. During these early years, both Adonis and Luciano were connected with the 5 Points Gang, one of the most powerful criminal organizations in New York. Led by Paolo Vaccarelli, known as Paul Kelly, the 5 Points Gang controlled much of Manhattan's Lower East Side and had connections throughout the city. The gang was involved in everything: prostitution, gambling, labor crimes, theft, and protection rackets. It was also heavily involved in Tammany Hall politics, providing muscle for political campaigns and getting out the vote, whether voters wanted to or not, for young criminals like Adonis and Luciano. The 5 Points Gang was like a criminal university. They learned how the systems worked, how crime and politics crossed paths, how to organize operations on a larger scale. They also learned the limits of the old system. The 5 Points Gang was powerful, but it was messy, prone to internal violence, and ultimately too old-fashioned to take full advantage of the opportunities that were coming. On January 17, 1920, the Volstead Act went into effect, putting into action the 18th Amendment to the Constitution. Alcohol was now illegal in the United States. It was, without question, the greatest gift the United States government ever gave to organized crime. Prohibition created a huge illegal market overnight. Millions of Americans still wanted to drink, and they were willing to pay high prices for alcohol. The people who could supply that alcohol, who could bring it in, make it, protect it, and deliver it, stood to make fortunes. Joe Adonis, now in his late teens, was perfectly positioned to take advantage. He knew the Brooklyn waterfront, where ships loaded with illegal alcohol from Canada and Europe could be unloaded. He knew the trucking companies that could transport it. He knew the speakeasy owners who would buy it. And through his friendship with Luciano and the network of young criminals they were building, he had the muscle to protect the operations. Adonis began working with various bootlegging operations in Brooklyn. The exact details of his early prohibition activities are unclear. These were illegal operations, and people didn't keep detailed records for obvious reasons. But by the early 1920s, he was clearly rising in the bootlegging world, making money, building a reputation, and gaining power. Through the 1920s, Adonis expanded his operations and strengthened his position. He wasn't just a bootlegger. He understood that prohibition was temporary, and smart criminals built varied portfolios. He invested in gambling operations. He got involved in labor crimes, particularly on the Brooklyn waterfront. He opened legitimate businesses that could serve as fronts and money laundering operations. One of his most successful businesses was opening restaurants and nightclubs. His main establishment, Joe's Italian Kitchen in Brooklyn, became famous. It was a real restaurant with genuine Italian food. But it was also a place where gangsters could meet, where deals could be made, where politicians and criminals could interact away from watching eyes. The restaurant served another purpose. It made Joe Adonis a public figure, but a respectable one. He wasn't just a gangster. He was a successful restaurant owner, a businessman, a pillar of the Italian-American community. He donated to churches, he helped families in need. He built relationships with local politicians and police. This was part of Adonis's genius. He understood public relations before the term was widely used. He knew that being purely a criminal made you vulnerable. But being a criminal who was also a respected community member gave you protection. As the decade came to a close, Joe Adonis was still a relatively young man. Only 27 in 1929, but he'd already gained significant wealth and power. He had operations throughout Brooklyn. He had political connections. He had a growing reputation as someone who was both smart and reliable. If Joe Adonis gave his word on something, he kept it. More importantly, he was part of a rising generation of Italian criminals who were frustrated with the old system. The traditional mafia brought from Sicily was run by mustache Petes, old-world bosses who held onto ancient feuds, who refused to work with non-Italians, who were more concerned with honor and respect than with money. The young Turks Luciano, Adonis, Vito Genovese, and others had different ideas. They'd been raised in America, or at least had come young enough to absorb American values. They understood that business was business, that old-world feuds were stupid and expensive, that working with Jewish and Irish gangsters made more money than fighting with them. Tensions were building between the old guard and the new generation. Those tensions were about to explode into a war that would change organized crime forever. But that's a story for the next chapter of Joe Adonis's life. By 1930, the divisions in New York's Italian underworld had become impossible to ignore. On one side stood the old guard, the mustache Petes, led by two powerful bosses, Joe the Boss Masiria in Manhattan and Salvatore Maranzano in Brooklyn. These men represented traditional Sicilian mafia values, feuds that stretched back to the old country, rigid hierarchies, and a deep suspicion of anyone who wasn't Sicilian. On the other side, though they couldn't yet organize openly, stood the young Turks, Lucky Luciano, Joe Adonis, Vito Genovese, Frank Costello, and their Jewish allies Meyer Lansky and Bugsy Siegel. These men wanted to modernize organized crime, to run it like a business rather than a medieval feud. The war that broke out between Masiria and Maranzano, known as the Castellamarese War after Maranzano's town of origin in Sicily, would rage from 1930 to 1931 on the surface. It was a traditional mafia war over territory and respect, but underneath it was a generational conflict, and the young criminals were playing both sides. Joe Adonis, like most of Luciano's crew, was officially loyal to Masiria. They attended his meetings, carried out his orders, and fought his battles, but secretly, they were plotting something far more radical. The meetings happened quietly, in back rooms, in private dining areas of restaurants like Joe's Italian Kitchen. Luciano, Adonis, Costello, Genovese, Lansky, and others discussed the future. They all agreed. Both Masiria and Maranzano had to go. The old guard had to be removed, and a new structure had to be created. One that would prevent these destructive wars. One that would let them all make money in peace. One that treated organized crime like the business it was. The plan they developed was bold and ruthless. They would help Maranzano win his war against Masiria. And then they would eliminate Maranzano too. It required patience, careful timing, and a willingness to betray everyone who trusted them. Joe Adonis played a crucial role in these plans. His restaurant in Brooklyn became one of the key meeting places where strategy was discussed. His Brooklyn operations provided muscle when needed, and his close friendship with Luciano made him one of the inner circle. One of the men who would help reshape American organized crime, April 15th, 1931. The day that changed everything, Joe the Boss Mafia, still unaware that his own men were plotting against him, agreed to have lunch with Lucky Luciano at Nuova Villa tomorrow, a restaurant in Coney Island. It was a beautiful spring day, and Mafia was in good spirits. The war seemed to be turning in his favor. He trusted Luciano completely. They ate well. Multiple courses, wine. The kind of long Italian meal that stretched through the afternoon. After eating, Mafia suggested they play cards. Luciano agreed. They sat at a table, and the game began. At some point, Luciano excused himself, saying he needed to use the restroom. The moment Luciano left the room, 4 men entered: Vito Genovese, Albert Anastasia, Joe Adonis, and Bugsy Siegel. They were all armed. Mafia, realizing what was happening, tried to rise from his seat. He never made it. The 4 men opened fire at point-blank range. Mafia's body jerked with the impact of the bullets, and he fell forward onto the card table, scattering the cards. He died instantly, blood pooling beneath him, his hand still holding his cards. An image that would become iconic in Mafia lore. By the time police arrived, Luciano had returned from the restroom, claiming he'd heard nothing, seen nothing. He said, just as shocked as anyone. The 4 gunmen had vanished into the Brooklyn streets. Joe Mafia, one of the most powerful mafia bosses in America, was dead. The Costello-Marie's war was essentially over. Salvatore Maranzano had won. But Maranzano's victory would be very short-lived. After Mafia's death, Maranzano moved quickly to consolidate power. He called a meeting of all the major Italian gangsters in New York. Hundreds of men, including Luciano, Adonis, Costello, Genovese, and others. The meeting took place in a large hall in the Bronx. Maranzano stood before them and declared himself boss of all bosses, capo di tutti capi. He reorganized the various Italian gangs into 5 families, each with its own territory and hierarchy. It was, in many ways, a rational structure. But Maranzano positioned himself above it all as the supreme authority. To the younger criminals, this was unacceptable. They hadn't killed Mafia just to replace him with another dictator. They listened to Maranzano's speech, nodded respectfully, and began planning his removal. Maranzano made their job easier by starting to act paranoid. He began making lists of men he considered threats, and Lucky Luciano's name was at the top. He started making plans to eliminate Luciano, Costello, Genovese, and others. But Luciano was moving faster, and Joe Adonis was helping him move. The murder of Salvatore Maranzano is one of the most carefully documented mob hits in history because it happened in broad daylight in a Manhattan office building. Maranzano kept an office on the 9th floor of the New York Central Building at 230 Park Avenue, posing as a real estate developer. On September 10, 1931. He was in his office with several associates when 4 men entered, claiming to be federal agents conducting an investigation. The agents were actually Jewish hitmen hired by Meyer Lansky and approved by Luciano. Using Jewish killers meant that Maranzano's Italian bodyguards wouldn't immediately be suspicious. The fake agents ordered everyone against the wall as if conducting a raid. Then they pulled out knives and a gun. Maranzano was stabbed multiple times and shot twice. He died on the floor of his office, his blood staining the expensive carpet. The killers walked out of the building before real police arrived. That same day, and in the days immediately following, there was a purge. The number varies depending on who's telling the story. Some accounts claim as many as 40 or 60 old guard mafia leaders were killed across the country. Modern historians suggest the number was probably smaller. perhaps a dozen to 20, but the impact was the same. The old guard was being removed, the mustache Petes were being purged, and a new structure was being built in their place. Joe Adonis, working primarily out of Brooklyn, helped coordinate some of these killings. His role wasn't always as the triggerman. Adonis was too smart and too valuable to risk on every hit. But he helped identify targets, coordinate logistics, and ensure that the Brooklyn operations ran smoothly during this crucial transition. The purge would later be called the Night of the Sicilian Vespers, after a medieval massacre in Sicily. It was the night the modern American Mafia was born, with both Masseria and Maranzano dead and the old guard purged. Luciano and his allies were free to put their vision into action. What they created was revolutionary: the Commission. The Commission was essentially a board of directors for organized crime. It would consist of the bosses of the 5 New York families, later increased to include families from other cities, meeting regularly to discuss business, settle disputes, and make decisions that affected everyone. Crucially, there would be no boss of all bosses. All the Commission members would be equals. At least in theory, disputes would be settled by vote. Territory would be respected, and everyone would follow rules designed to keep the peace and maximize profit. It was, in its way, brilliantly American. Organized crime run as a corporation, with checks and balances, with structure and hierarchy, but without a single dictator who could abuse power. Joe Adonis wasn't initially a commission member. Those seats went to the family bosses. But he was part of the inner circle, one of the key advisors, one of the men who helped create the system. His close relationship with Luciano meant he had significant influence, even without an official title. More importantly, Adonis was given control of critical operations in Brooklyn, particularly the waterfront. This made him immensely powerful and wealthy. He was no longer just a gangster. He was a key figure in a national criminal organization. The Commission was just one part of the new structure: Luciano, Lansky, Adonis. And the others had an even broader vision: a national crime syndicate that would coordinate criminal activity across the entire country. The syndicate would include not just Italian criminals, but Jewish gangsters, Irish gangsters, anyone who could be useful and trusted. It would coordinate bootlegging while Prohibition lasted, gambling, labor crimes, loan sharking, and other profitable activities. One of the syndicate's most famous, or infamous, creations was Murder, Inc., a group of professional killers primarily based in Brooklyn who would carry out hits for the organization. The beauty of Murder, Inc. was that it separated the killers from the people ordering the hits. If someone needed to be eliminated, the order went to Murder, Inc., and professional hitmen who had no personal connection to the target carried out the job. This made investigations much harder for law enforcement. Joe Adonis had strong connections to Murder, Inc., particularly through his Brooklyn operations. While he wasn't directly involved in running the murder crew, that was primarily the domain of Louis Buhalter and Albert Anastasia Adonis's organization, used their services when needed and provided support for their operations. Through the 1930s, Joe Adonis consolidated his control over Brooklyn's criminal operations. His empire had several key parts. The waterfront. Brooklyn's docks were crucial to the city's economy, and Adonis controlled much of the labor on those docks. Through a combination of legitimate unions that he influenced and outright control of hiring, he could ensure that ships were loaded and unloaded, or not loaded and unloaded, as he saw fit. This gave him immense power and generated substantial income through kickbacks, theft, and protection payments. Gambling. Adonis ran extensive gambling operations, bookmaking, numbers running, illegal casinos, and card games. Gambling was enormously profitable and had the advantage of involving willing participants rather than victims, at least from the criminal's perspective. Labor racketeering. Beyond the waterfront, Adonis's influence extended into various unions and labor organizations. He could call strikes, prevent strikes, ensure contracts went to certain companies. All for a price, legitimate businesses. Adonis was smart enough to invest his illegal profits into legitimate businesses. Beyond his famous restaurant, he owned or had interests in nightclubs, bars, trucking companies, and various other enterprises. These provided both income and cover for his illegal activities. One of Adonis's greatest strengths was his ability to build relationships with politicians, judges, and law enforcement. He understood, perhaps better than most of his criminal associates, that the key to long-term success wasn't just violence and intimidation, it was corruption. Adonis developed relationships with Tammany Hall politicians in Manhattan and their equivalents in Brooklyn. He made campaign contributions, delivered votes from his neighborhoods, and provided various services. In return, he got protection, favorable treatment, and advance warning of investigations. He also developed relationships with judges. The details of many of these relationships have been lost to history. People didn't exactly document their corrupt dealings, but the results were clear. Cases against Adonis's operations had a way of being dismissed. Evidence had a way of disappearing, and witnesses had a way of forgetting what they'd seen. Crucially, Adonis knew how to be discreet, unlike some criminals who showed off their connections and power. Adonis kept a relatively low profile. He didn't seek publicity. He didn't give interviews. He operated in the shadows. Where he was most effective, one of Adonis's most profitable operations was the automotive conveying company, which he owned with several partners. On the surface, it was a legitimate business that transported new cars from manufacturers to dealerships in the New York area. But it was also a masterpiece of criminal innovation. Adonis and his partners had essentially created a monopoly. They controlled most of the car transportation in the region, and they could charge whatever they wanted. If a dealership didn't want to pay their inflated prices, they could wait weeks or months for their cars to arrive. Most businesses decided paying was easier. The operation generated millions of dollars in profit and had the advantage of being technically legal. Or at least legal-ish. Yes, it was essentially extortion, but it was wrapped in the appearance of legitimate business, which made it much harder for authorities to prosecute. This was Adonis's style. Find the gray areas, exploit them, and make them as profitable as possible. On December 5, 1933, the 21st Amendment was ratified. Repealing Prohibition, alcohol was legal again. For many bootleggers, this was a disaster. Their primary source of income had just evaporated. But for smart criminals like Adonis, Luciano, and Lansky, it was just a transition. They'd never relied entirely on bootlegging, and they'd used their prohibition profits to diversify into other areas. Adonis was perfectly positioned. His gambling operations were thriving. His labor racketeering continued. His legitimate businesses were making money. And he'd even moved into legal alcohol distribution. Former bootleggers who knew the alcohol business inside and out often got licenses to become legitimate distributors once Prohibition ended. The repeal of Prohibition also marked the end of the period of absolute mob dominance in some areas, but it didn't end organized crime. It just shifted the focus to other areas throughout this period. Adonis carefully cultivated his public image. He lived well, but not ostentatiously. He wore expensive suits, but not so flashy that they screamed gangster. He drove nice cars, but not the most expensive ones. He wanted to look like a successful businessman, not a criminal. He married and had children, maintaining what appeared to be a stable family life. Unlike some gangsters whose personal lives were chaotic messes of affairs and domestic violence, Adonis kept his family life relatively private and scandal-free. His restaurant, Joe's Italian Kitchen, remained a fixture in Brooklyn. It attracted not just criminals, but celebrities, politicians, athletes, and regular customers who just wanted good Italian food. Adonis would often be there, greeting customers, making sure everyone was taken care of, playing the role of the gracious host. This duality, brutal gangster and charming restaurant owner, was central to Adonis's success. He could order someone killed in the afternoon and then host a birthday party for a local politician's child in the evening. And he could keep those two worlds completely separate in his mind. As the 1930s drew to a close, Joe Adonis was at the height of his power. He was only in his mid-30s, but he'd already been a major figure in organized crime for over a decade. He was wealthy, powerful, and respected or feared throughout the criminal underworld. His friendship with Lucky Luciano remained strong. Though Luciano's situation was becoming complicated, in 1936, Luciano had been convicted on prostitution charges in what many historians consider a politically motivated prosecution, and he was serving a lengthy prison sentence in upstate New York. But even from prison, Luciano remained influential, and Adonis was one of his key liaisons to the outside world. Adonis had also developed a close working relationship with Frank Costello, who was emerging as one of the most powerful mobsters in America. Costello, known as the Prime Minister of the Underworld, was a master of political corruption and had connections throughout New York's political establishment. The Costello-Adonis partnership would become one of the most powerful alliances in the mob. But the world was changing. In Europe, war had broken out, and it would soon engulf America as well. That war would create new opportunities and new dangers for the American Mafia. And for Joe Adonis, December 7, 1941, Pearl Harbor, America entered World War II. And suddenly everything changed, even for organized crime. The war created unique opportunities for criminals who controlled the waterfront. And no one controlled the waterfront better than Joe Adonis and his associates. The Brooklyn and New Jersey docks became absolutely critical to the war effort. Millions of tons of supplies, equipment, and troops flowed through these ports on their way to Europe and the Pacific. This meant the docks became targets. German submarines operated off the East Coast, and there was genuine concern about sabotage, spying, and German agents infiltrating the ports. The military needed security, and they needed information. And that meant they needed the mob. The resulting cooperation between the U.S. government and organized crime remains one of the most controversial episodes in American history. Naval intelligence officials met with mob leaders, including Meyer Lansky, and through intermediaries, Lucky Luciano, who was still in prison, the criminals agreed to watch the waterfront, prevent sabotage, and provide intelligence in return. They got unofficial protection for their operations and, eventually, help with Luciano's legal situation. Joe Adonis played a significant role in these arrangements, though the exact details remain unclear. His control over Brooklyn's waterfront made him valuable to military authorities, whether they wanted to admit it or not. Through his dock workers and his network of informants, he could monitor activity on the waterfront, identify suspicious individuals, and ensure that cargo flowed smoothly. Some accounts suggest Adonis even helped coordinate intelligence gathering among Italian-American communities, identifying fascist sympathizers and potential security threats. Whether this was genuine patriotism, practical business, or simply a way to eliminate rivals by branding them as security threats remains debated by historians. One incident from this period has fueled speculation for decades: the fire that destroyed the SS Normandy in February 1942. The Normandy, a massive French luxury liner, had been seized by the U.S. government and was being converted into a troop ship at a Manhattan pier when fire broke out. The ship capsized and was effectively destroyed, a major blow to the war effort and a spectacular disaster. The official investigation concluded the fire was accidental, caused by a welder's torch igniting life preservers. But rumors persisted that the mob had started the fire as a demonstration of their power, essentially telling the government, "See what can happen if you don't work with us." Various mob figures, including Joe Adonis, were later said to have been involved in these rumors. Some accounts claimed the fire was indeed arson orchestrated by the mob to force the government's hand in cooperating with them and potentially securing Luciano's release from prison. Modern historians are skeptical of these claims. The evidence points to an actual accident, and the idea that the mob would intentionally destroy a ship that could have been used to transport American troops seems counterproductive. But the rumors themselves are significant. They show how powerful the mob had become that people found it believable they could destroy a massive ship in broad daylight in New York Harbor. During the 1940s, Joe Adonis began expanding his operations significantly into New Jersey, particularly Bergen County and the areas across the Hudson River from Manhattan. This expansion would prove to be both enormously profitable and ultimately the source of his downfall. New Jersey in the 1940s was wide open for gambling operations. While New York had significant law enforcement pressure and political complications, New Jersey, particularly certain counties, was more accommodating to organized crime. Local politicians and law enforcement could be bought more cheaply and controlled more completely than their counterparts in New York City. Adonis established or invested in numerous illegal casinos and gambling operations throughout New Jersey. These weren't small-time poker games in back rooms. They were elaborate, sophisticated operations, plush carpets, professional dealers, high-quality food and drink, entertainment. They catered to wealthy clients from New York who would drive across the river or through the tunnels to gamble where it was safer and more discreet. One of his most famous establishments was the Riviera nightclub in Fort Lee, New Jersey, which he owned in partnership with other criminals. The Riviera was officially a legitimate nightclub and restaurant, featuring big-name entertainers and excellent Italian cuisine. But it also housed an extensive illegal casino in the back rooms. The Riviera became a celebrity hotspot. Frank Sinatra performed there, politicians dined there, business executives gambled there. It was the kind of place where mob sophistication reached its peak, where the criminal and the legitimate worlds mingled so thoroughly that the line between them became almost invisible. Adonis also invested in other New Jersey gambling operations: the Colonial Inn in Hallandale, various smaller casinos, bookmaking operations, and numbers rackets. The profits were enormous, millions of dollars flowing through these operations annually, much of it in cash that was difficult for authorities to trace during this period. Joe Adonis's partnership with Frank Costello deepened and became one of the most powerful alliances in American organized crime. Costello, like Adonis, was a master of the subtle approach to crime. He didn't engage in flashy violence or public displays. Instead, he worked through corruption, political influence, and quiet intimidation. He had connections throughout New York's political establishment, from district leaders to judges to city officials. The Costello-Adonis partnership divided responsibilities effectively. Costello focused more on Manhattan, on political corruption, on the subtle manipulation of the city's power structures. Adonis focused more on Brooklyn and New Jersey, on the nuts and bolts of gambling operations, waterfront control, and the harder aspects of enforcement. But they collaborated constantly. They shared interests in various operations. They consulted each other on major decisions. They backed each other up when challenges arose. Together, they formed one of the most formidable power centers in the mob, perhaps less publicly famous than some other gangsters, but arguably more powerful and certainly more stable throughout this period. The question of Lucky Luciano hung over everyone in the mob. Luciano, who had essentially created the modern American Mafia, who remained the most respected figure in organized crime, was in prison, serving what amounted to a life sentence for his prostitution conviction. Joe Adonis remained one of Luciano's most loyal friends. He visited Luciano in prison regularly. He helped manage Luciano's interests on the outside. He worked on efforts to secure Luciano's release, or at least a reduction in his sentence. The wartime cooperation between the mob and naval intelligence eventually paid dividends for Luciano. In 1946, Governor Thomas Dewey of New York, ironically, the same prosecutor who had sent Luciano to prison, commuted his sentence on the condition that Luciano be immediately deported to Italy. It was a bittersweet victory. Luciano was free, but he could never return to America, the country where he'd built his empire. On February 9, 1946, Luciano was escorted to a ship and sent into exile. Joe Adonis was devastated by his friend's deportation. They'd been partners since they were teenagers running on the Brooklyn streets. They'd built the modern mafia together. And now Luciano was gone, exiled to Italy, cut off from the empire he'd created. But Adonis also understood that Luciano's deportation created opportunities. With Luciano gone, power would shift among those who remained. Costello would rise even higher. Vito Genovese, who had returned from his own exile in Italy, where he'd fled to avoid murder charges, would start maneuvering for power. And Adonis himself would need to carefully navigate these changing dynamics. In December 1946, shortly after his deportation, Lucky Luciano orchestrated one of the most famous mob meetings in history, the Havana Conference. Luciano, supposedly exiled permanently to Italy, had made his way to Cuba, just 90 miles from the American shores he'd been forbidden to approach. In Havana, he called together the major figures of American organized crime for a meeting that would discuss the future of the mob. Joe Adonis was there, of course. So was Frank Costello, Vito Genovese, Meyer Lansky, and numerous other major criminals. Even young rising stars attended, including a skinny singer from Hoboken named Frank Sinatra, who allegedly was carrying a suitcase full of money as a gift for Luciano. The conference took place at the Hotel Nacional, one of Havana's most luxurious establishments, for several days. The most powerful criminals in America discussed business while enjoying the tropical paradise of pre-Castro Cuba. The conference had several purposes. First, Luciano wanted to reassert his leadership over the organization he'd created. Second, they needed to discuss various business matters, gambling operations in Cuba, coordination between different families, ongoing disputes. Third, and most dramatically, they needed to deal with Bugsy Siegel, Luciano and Lansky's old friend, had been sent to develop gambling operations in Las Vegas, but he'd become problematic. He was spending money wildly on the Flamingo Casino. He was possibly skimming funds, and he was drawing too much law enforcement attention. The consensus at Havana was that Siegel needed to be eliminated. Joe Adonis participated in these discussions, though by most accounts he was one of the more reluctant voices regarding the Siegel hit. Siegel had been a friend and ally for years, but business was business, and if Siegel had become a liability, personal feelings couldn't protect him. 6 months after the Havana Conference, on June 20, 1947, Bugsy Siegel was shot dead in Beverly Hills. The murder was never officially solved, but everyone in the mob knew who had ordered it and why. By the late 1940s, Joe Adonis had settled into a particular pattern of life, one that combined the daily grind of criminal operations with the trappings of success and respectability. His typical day might begin at his home in Brooklyn, or increasingly at his estate in New Jersey. He'd dress impeccably. Adonis remained extraordinarily conscious of his appearance, always wearing the finest suits, his hair perfectly styled, his shoes shined to a mirror finish. Even in his 40s, he remained strikingly handsome, living up to the nickname that had followed him since youth. He'd make his rounds, visiting his restaurant, checking on various operations, meeting with associates. These meetings might take place in the back room of Joe's Italian kitchen, in a legitimate business office, in a car driving through Brooklyn, or in any of numerous locations where he conducted business. The business itself was diverse. On any given day, He might be dealing with waterfront labor issues, settling a dispute between gambling operations, discussing a new business investment, handling a political problem, meeting with corrupt officials who needed their payments, or planning some new operation. But he'd also engage in the theater of legitimacy. He'd have lunch with businessmen, he'd attend charity events, he'd make donations to churches and community organizations. He'd be seen at restaurants and nightclubs with his wife, playing the role of the successful Italian-American businessman. This duality was key to Adonis's longevity. He was a gangster, but he was also a public figure who seemed respectable. He was violent when necessary, but he didn't leave bodies in the street. He was corrupt, but his corruption was sophisticated enough that it looked almost legitimate. Despite his criminal career, Adonis maintained what appeared to be a stable family life. He was married and had children, though the exact details of his family life remained private, as Adonis was careful to keep his family separated from his criminal activities. Unlike many criminals whose personal lives were chaotic disasters of affairs, domestic violence, and dysfunction, Adonis seemed to maintain relatively normal family relationships. He attended his children's school events, he celebrated holidays, he maintained the facade and perhaps the reality of being a devoted father and husband. This respectability was part of his armor. Prosecutors and investigators found it harder to vilify a man who seemed to be a good father and community member. Juries were more sympathetic to defendants who appeared to be family men rather than obvious thugs. Whether Adonis's family life represented genuine devotion or merely sophisticated role-playing is impossible to know with certainty. Perhaps it was both. He could be genuinely caring toward his family while also recognizing that this image served his interests. By the late 1940s, Adonis was extremely wealthy. The exact amount is impossible to determine. Gangsters don't file accurate tax returns, but conservative estimates put his annual income in the millions of dollars. An enormous sum for that era. He invested this money strategically. Beyond his criminal operations and his legitimate businesses like the restaurant and nightclubs, he invested in real estate. He owned properties in Brooklyn, Manhattan, and New Jersey. He had interests in various corporations and partnerships, often through front men who officially owned businesses that Adonis actually controlled. He was also careful about showing wealth, unlike some gangsters who flaunted their money with ostentatious displays. Adonis understood that appearing too wealthy invited attention from tax investigators. He lived well, but not so lavishly that he couldn't explain his lifestyle as the result of legitimate business success. This financial sophistication was one of Adonis's greatest strengths. While other criminals got caught because they couldn't explain where their money came from, Adonis had carefully constructed a paper trail of legitimate income that, while probably not matching his actual wealth, at least provided plausible deniability. By the late 1940s, the vision that Luciano, Lansky, Adonis, and the others had developed in the early 1930s had fully matured. Organized crime in America had become, in many ways, indistinguishable from legitimate big business. The mob had hierarchies, territories, business plans, investments, diversification, and long-term strategies. Disputes were usually settled through negotiation rather than violence, because violence was bad for business. Political connections were cultivated and maintained like any other business relationship. New opportunities were evaluated based on profit potential and risk assessment. Joe Adonis exemplified this business-like approach to crime. He wasn't a hothead who killed at the slightest insult. He wasn't a flashy showman who courted publicity. He was a businessman who happened to operate outside the law. And he ran his criminal empire with the same attention to efficiency, profit, and sustainability that a CEO might bring to a legitimate corporation. This sophistication also meant that the mob had become deeply woven into the fabric of American society. Their gambling operations served millions of customers. Their labor rackets touched numerous industries. Their political connections reached into city halls, state houses, and even Washington. They weren't just criminals operating on the margins, they were integrated into the system. But even as Joe Adonis reached the peak of his power and wealth, forces were gathering that would threaten everything he'd built. The late 1940s and early 1950s would see a dramatic shift in how America dealt with organized crime. New investigative techniques were being developed. Federal law enforcement was becoming more sophisticated, and perhaps most importantly, public awareness of and concern about organized crime was growing. The cozy relationship between gangsters and politicians, the corruption that protected criminal operations, the seeming invincibility of major mob figures, all of this was about to be exposed to harsh public scrutiny. The agent of this exposure would be a committee, a group of senators armed with subpoena power and, for the first time, television cameras. The Kefauver Committee hearings would bring the American Mafia into living rooms across the nation and would mark the beginning of the end for the golden age of American organized crime. And Joe Adonis, the beautiful gangster who had avoided prison for decades, who had built an empire through intelligence and careful planning, would find himself in the spotlight, a place he'd spent his entire career trying to avoid. On May 3, 1950, the United States Senate established the Special Committee to investigate organized crime in interstate commerce, chaired by Senator Estes Kefauver of Tennessee. The committee would come to be known simply as the Kefauver Committee, and it would change everything. Senator Kefauver was an ambitious politician with presidential aspirations, but he was also genuinely concerned about organized crime. He'd seen how the mob operated in various cities, how corruption protected criminal operations, how ordinary citizens suffered. He convinced his fellow senators that a major investigation was needed, and he got the subpoena power to make it happen. What made the Kefauver Committee different from previous investigations was television. The hearings were broadcast live, and millions of Americans watched as gangsters, corrupt politicians, and law enforcement officials testified about the reality of organized crime in America. It was reality television before the term existed. Real criminals, real corruption, real drama unfolding on live TV. The committee held hearings in 14 cities across America, from Miami to Los Angeles, from Kansas City to New York. They interviewed hundreds of witnesses. They exposed gambling operations, political corruption, police payoffs, and the vast networks of organized crime that had spread across the country. From men like Joe Adonis, who had spent decades operating in the shadows, avoiding publicity and maintaining plausible deniability. The Kefauver Committee was a nightmare. A subpoena for Joe Adonis came in early 1951. He was ordered to appear before the committee and answer questions about his activities, his associates, and his role in organized crime. Adonis faced a difficult choice if he refused to appear. He could be held in contempt of Congress. If he appeared and answered questions honestly, he'd incriminate himself and his associates. If he appeared and refused to answer questions, invoking his Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination, he'd essentially be admitting he was a criminal. And on national television, there was no good option but Adonis. After consulting with lawyers and with Frank Costello and other mob leaders, decided he had to appear. Refusing would only make things worse. Joe Adonis appeared before the Kefauver Committee on March 19th to 20th, 1951 in New York. The hearings were televised, and millions of Americans watched as the handsome, impeccably dressed gangster took his seat at the witness table. Senator Kefauver, a tall, folksy Tennessean, led the questioning. He was polite but persistent, asking Adonis about his background, his businesses, his income, his associates, and his criminal activities. Adonis, coached by excellent lawyers, was prepared. He answered some questions, usually the ones that were already matters of public record or couldn't hurt him. But for most questions, particularly anything that might be incriminating. He invoked his Fifth Amendment privilege. "Mr. Adonis, are you involved in illegal gambling operations in New Jersey? I respectfully decline to answer on the grounds that it may tend to incriminate me." "Mr. Adonis, do you know Frank Costello?" "I respectfully decline to answer on the grounds that it may tend to incriminate me." "Mr. Adonis, what is the source of your income?" "I respectfully decline to answer on the grounds that it may tend to incriminate me." Over and over, question after question, Adonis invoked the Fifth Amendment. He was careful, controlled, and clearly intelligent, but also clearly hiding something. The television audience ate it up. Here was a real gangster, admitting through his silence that he had things to hide. The mystique of the mob, which had protected men like Adonis for years, was being stripped away. America was seeing the reality of organized crime, and they didn't like what they saw. A few days after Adonis's appearance, Frank Costello testified. Costello's testimony became even more famous than Adonis's because of a peculiar television decision. Costello's lawyers objected to having his face shown on television, arguing that it violated his rights. The committee agreed to a compromise. They'd only show his hands, so for hours, television cameras focused on Costello's hands as he answered questions, his fingers nervously fidgeting, tapping, clasping, and unclasping. Those hands became iconic, symbols of nervous guilt, of secrets being kept, of a criminal trying to maintain composure under pressure. Like Adonis, Costello invoked the Fifth Amendment repeatedly. And like Adonis, his refusal to answer questions was almost as damaging as any admission could have been. The testimony of Adonis, Costello, and numerous other criminals exposed the scope of organized crime in America. The committee's final report, issued in 1951, was devastating. It described a vast criminal enterprise that had infiltrated legitimate business, corrupted politics, and operated with impunity for decades. The public reaction to the Kefauver hearings was intense. Organized crime became a major national issue. Newspapers ran extensive coverage, magazines published exposes, churches preached sermons about moral corruption. Reform movements gained momentum in numerous cities. Politicians who had been cozy with the mob suddenly found it politically dangerous to maintain those relationships. Police departments that had looked the other way for years found themselves under pressure to actually enforce the law. Prosecutors who had declined to pursue cases against criminals found their careers threatened if they didn't start getting convictions. For the mob, this was catastrophic. The whole system had been built on operating in the shadows, on maintaining plausible deniability, on the public not fully understanding or caring about organized crime. The Kefauver Committee had destroyed all of that. Joe Adonis, watching the fallout, understood that his world was changing. The old ways, corruption, payoffs, political protection, would still work, but they'd be harder and more expensive. Law enforcement would be more aggressive, juries would be less sympathetic, and the mob itself would have to adapt or die. Following the Kefauver hearings, prosecutors across the country felt pressure to actually do something about organized crime. For Joe Adonis, this meant increasing legal troubles in New Jersey, where he'd operated numerous gambling operations with relative impunity. Prosecutors began building a case against him. Grand juries were convened. Witnesses were interviewed. Evidence was gathered. The protection that had shielded his operations for years was weakening. Adonis tried to maintain his operations while dealing with the legal pressure. He became more careful, more secretive, more cautious about what he said and who he said it to. He consulted constantly with lawyers, trying to find ways to protect himself. But the walls were closing in. In 1951, he was convicted of violating New Jersey's gambling laws, a relatively minor charge, but a conviction nonetheless. He appealed, trying to delay any actual punishment, while his lawyers sought to overturn the verdict. The conviction was significant, not just because of the sentence, which was relatively light, 2 to 3 years in prison, but because it established that Joe Adonis could be prosecuted and convicted. The untouchable gangster had been touched as Adonis's legal troubles mounted. Another issue emerged that would prove even more dangerous: his citizenship status. Adonis had always claimed to be a U.S. citizen, born in America. Some documents supported this claim, suggesting he'd been born in Passaic, New Jersey in 1902. But other evidence suggested he'd actually been born in Italy and immigrated as a child, which would make him a foreign national, not a citizen. This might seem like a minor bureaucratic detail, but it was actually crucial. If Adonis was a foreign national and had been convicted of crimes, he could be deported, and deportation would mean the end of his American empire. Federal investigators began digging into Adonis's background, trying to determine the truth about his birth and citizenship. They found inconsistencies in his story. They found evidence suggesting he'd been born in Italy. They found witnesses who remembered the Dodo family arriving from Italy when Giuseppe was a boy. Adonis's lawyers fought back, producing documents that supported his claim of American birth. They challenged the government's evidence. They argued that even if there were questions about his citizenship, he'd lived in America so long and had been treated as a citizen for so long that he should be considered one. But the government was persistent. The political pressure to do something about organized crime was intense, and deporting a major mob figure would be a significant victory. Deportation proceedings were initiated against Joe Adonis. The pressure from law enforcement wasn't the only problem facing Joe Adonis. The mob itself was becoming unstable, with Lucky Luciano in exile. The power structure that had maintained relative peace since the early 1930s was weakening. Vito Genovese, who had returned from his own exile in Italy, was maneuvering for power. He wanted to become the boss of bosses, the kind of single dominant figure that Luciano had specifically designed the commission system to prevent. Frank Costello, Joe Adonis's close ally, was Genovese's primary target. Genovese saw Costello as an obstacle to his ambitions and began plotting against him. This put Adonis in a difficult position. His loyalty to Costello was clear, but opposing Genovese could be dangerous. The conflict would eventually explode into open violence. In 1957, Genovese would order a hit on Costello. The assassination attempt failed. The gunman only grazed Costello's head, and Costello survived. But the message was clear: the old alliances were breaking down, and the mob was entering a more chaotic period for Adonis. These internal conflicts added to his problems. He couldn't fully protect his interests when he was fighting battles on multiple fronts: law enforcement from outside, political enemies from inside the mob, beyond his specific legal and political problems. Adonis faced a larger reality. The world that had made his career possible was disappearing. The cozy corruption of the 1930s and 1940s, where criminals and politicians worked hand in hand, was becoming politically untenable. The public awareness created by the Kefauver hearings meant that officials who were too openly friendly with the mob faced serious political consequences. Television itself was changing things. It was harder to maintain secrecy when cameras could broadcast images into millions of homes. It was harder to operate in the shadows when investigative journalists were shining lights into every corner. Federal law enforcement was also becoming more sophisticated. The FBI, which under J. Edgar Hoover had long denied that the Mafia even existed, was finally being forced to acknowledge organized crime and dedicate resources to fighting it. New investigative techniques were being developed. Electronic surveillance was becoming more common. The mob would survive these changes. Organized crime didn't disappear in the 1950s, but it had to adapt, and not everyone could adapt successfully. For someone like Joe Adonis, whose career had been built on the old system, the new reality was profoundly challenging. By 1953, Joe Adonis faced a moment of truth. His appeal of the New Jersey gambling conviction had failed. He was going to have to serve his sentence, 2 to 3 years in prison, and the deportation proceedings were ongoing. With the government building a strong case that he'd been born in Italy and could therefore be deported, Adonis consulted with lawyers, with Frank Costello, with other mob leaders. His options were limited and all bad. He could continue fighting both the criminal conviction and the deportation, spending years in legal battles that he'd probably lose eventually. He could serve his prison sentence and hope the deportation case would somehow go away. But that seemed unlikely given the political pressure. He could flee to avoid prison and deportation, but that would mean abandoning his empire and living as a fugitive. Or he could accept the inevitable, serve his time, and if deportation came, accept exile. For a man who'd spent his entire adult life building power and wealth in America, these were all devastating options, but Adonis was a pragmatist. He'd survived this long by understanding reality and adapting to it. Even when he didn't like it, in the end, Joe Adonis made a decision that would define his final years. He would accept what was coming, serve his sentence, and if deportation followed, he'd accept exile. He'd lost this battle, and continuing to fight would only make things worse. It was a bitter pill for the beautiful gangster to swallow. But perhaps he understood something that many of his contemporaries didn't. Sometimes knowing when you've lost is the only way to survive. In 1953, Joe Adonis began serving his sentence for illegal gambling at the New Jersey State Prison in Trenton. For a man who'd never spent a day in prison for criminal work, despite decades of criminal activity, it must have been a profound shock. Prison for a high-profile criminal wasn't quite the same as prison for an ordinary prisoner. Adonis had money, connections, and a reputation that commanded respect even behind bars. He probably received better treatment than most inmates, better cell, better food, fewer problems from other prisoners. But it was still prison, still confinement, still a loss of freedom that must have been particularly stinging for someone who'd operated with such autonomy for so long. The man who'd controlled gambling empires, who'd moved freely between Brooklyn and New Jersey and anywhere else he wanted to go, was now confined to a cell, his movements controlled by guards, his day regulated by prison schedules. During his time in prison, the deportation case continued. Government lawyers presented evidence that Giuseppe Antonio Dodo had been born in Montemerano, Italy, and had immigrated to America as a child. They produced records from Italy, testimony from witnesses, documentation that contradicted Adonis's claims of American birth. Adonis's lawyers fought back, but their arguments were weakening. The evidence for Italian birth was becoming overwhelming, and even if there were doubts, the political pressure to deport him was so intense that the legal system was inclined to resolve those doubts against him. In 1956, while Adonis was still serving his prison sentence, the final deportation order came through. The U.S. government had determined that he was not a citizen, that he'd been born in Italy, and that his criminal conviction made him subject to deportation. Adonis had exhausted his appeals. There were no more legal maneuvers available. When he completed his prison sentence, he would be immediately put on a ship to Italy. He would be barred from ever returning to the United States. For Joe Adonis, this must have been devastating. He'd left Italy as a small child. His memories of the country were vague at best. He'd spent virtually his entire life in America. Specifically in Brooklyn and New Jersey, he'd built an empire here. His family was here. His fortune was here. His identity was fundamentally American, despite his Italian birth. But the government was unmoved. Joe Adonis, born Giuseppe Antonio Dodo in Montemerano, Italy, would return to Italy as his release date approached. Adonis had to make arrangements for his life in exile. He needed to ensure that his business interests in America would be protected and that money would be available to him in Italy. He needed to say goodbye to family, friends, and associates who would remain in America while he was forced to leave. Frank Costello visited him before his deportation. The two men, who'd been partners and friends for decades, had what must have been an emotional meeting. They both knew they'd probably never see each other again. Costello would continue to operate in America, though with his own increasing legal and internal mob pressures. Adonis would be gone, exiled to a country he barely remembered. Other old associates came to see him off as well. These weren't sentimental people. They were hardened criminals who participated in violence, corruption, and exploitation for decades. But there was genuine emotion in these farewells. They'd come up together, built something together, survived together. And now one of their own was being sent away on January 3, 1956. Joe Adonis boarded a ship in New York Harbor, bound for Naples, Italy. He was 53 years old. He'd spent nearly 5 decades in America, building power and wealth, surviving when many of his contemporaries had been killed or imprisoned, and now it was ending. Not with bullets or a lengthy prison sentence, but with forced exile. As the ship pulled away from the dock, Adonis stood on deck, watching the New York skyline recede, a city where he'd made his fortune, where he'd built his empire, where he'd become someone. It was disappearing behind him, and he'd never see it again. The voyage across the Atlantic gave him time to think, to reflect on the life he'd lived and the life he was being forced to leave behind. He'd won far more often than he'd lost. He'd accumulated wealth that would sustain him in exile. He'd survived when many others had fallen. But none of that changed the fundamental reality. He'd lost. The government had beaten him. And there was nothing he could do about it. The ship docked in Naples, and Joe Adonis set foot in Italy for the first time in nearly 50 years. Italian authorities were waiting for him. They'd been notified of his arrival and were monitoring this deported American gangster. Italy in 1956 was very different from the Italy Adonis had left as a child. It had been through a brutal war and occupation. The old order had collapsed and then rebuilt. The country was modernizing, trying to move past its fascist past and rebuild its economy and society. Adonis settled initially in Milan in northern Italy. Milan was sophisticated, urban, more similar to New York than the rural southern villages. He rented an apartment, established himself, and tried to figure out what his life would be now. He had money. His American associates ensured that funds were transferred to him, probably through complex money laundering schemes that kept the money away from government scrutiny. He wouldn't live in poverty, but he also couldn't live the life he'd had in America. Joe Adonis's life in Milan was a strange mixture of comfort and irrelevance. He lived well. Good apartment, good food, good clothes. He maintained his appearance, still dressing impeccably, still looking like the handsome gangster who'd been named after a god. But he had no power. His empire was in America, being run by others. He could give advice through intermediaries, could maintain some connections, but he couldn't control operations from across the Atlantic. The man who'd controlled Brooklyn's waterfront, who'd run gambling operations across New Jersey, who'd sat at tables with the most powerful criminals in America, was now just an old exile in Milan, cut off from the world he'd known. Italian authorities kept an eye on him. They were suspicious of this deported American gangster and worried he might try to establish criminal operations in Italy. They monitored his activities, watched his associates, and made it clear that he was not welcome to bring American mob methods to Italy. Adonis spent his days much as elderly exiles do everywhere. He'd walk the streets of Milan. He'd sit in cafes, drinking espresso and reading newspapers, both Italian papers and, when he could get them, American papers that told him what was happening in the world he'd lost. He'd occasionally meet with other exiles, Italian criminals who'd been deported, Italian Americans who'd moved back to Italy for various reasons. They'd talk about the old days, about Brooklyn and Manhattan, about operations and scores, about friends who were dead or in prison or still operating. but mostly he was alone with his thoughts and his memories. Through the late 1950s and 1960s, Joe Adonis watched from exile as the American mob world he'd helped create continued to evolve and often self-destruct. He read about the Appalachian Meeting in 1957, where dozens of mob leaders gathered at a house in upstate New York, only to be raided by police. The meeting, intended to settle internal disputes and discuss business, instead became a public relations disaster that confirmed everything the Kefauver Committee had revealed about organized crime. He read about Vito Genovese's attempt to consolidate power, about the internal conflicts that consumed the mob through the late 1950s. He read about the increasing pressure from law enforcement, about new prosecutions, about the FBI's intensifying focus on organized crime. He read about Frank Costello's survival of the assassination attempt ordered by Genovese, and about Costello's subsequent retreat from active mob leadership. His old friend and partner had survived, but was no longer the power he'd once been. He read about Lucky Luciano, also in exile in Italy, also watching from afar as the empire they'd created together evolved without them. Luciano died in 1962 at the age of 64 at the Naples airport, reportedly while meeting with an American film producer who wanted to make a movie about his life, the boss of bosses. The man who'd created the modern American Mafia died in Italy, far from the country where he'd built his empire. For Joe Adonis, the years in Milan must have been profoundly lonely. He'd been forced to leave behind everything that had defined him: his power, his operations, his position, his country. He was cut off from the daily operations, the decisions, the action that had filled his life for decades. He'd also lost his purpose for his entire adult life. He'd been building something, maintaining operations, accumulating power and wealth. Now, in his 50s and then his 60s, all of that was gone. He had money, but no empire. He had memories, but no future in the world he'd known. Some accounts from this period suggest he grew depressed. Other accounts claim he accepted his fate with stoic resignation. The truth was probably somewhere in between. Some days of depression, some days of acceptance, some days when the memories were sweet, and some days when they were bitter. He maintained what connections he could to America. Associates would visit occasionally, bringing news and messages. Money continued to flow to him. But it wasn't the same. He was no longer Joe Adonis, the powerful Brooklyn mob leader. He was just an old man in exile, living off past glories while Adonis lived in exile. The American mob was undergoing dramatic changes that would have been almost unimaginable when he'd been at his peak. The FBI, under pressure after years of denying the Mafia's existence, had launched massive investigations. Electronic surveillance was becoming more sophisticated. Informants were being cultivated. New laws were being developed specifically to target organized crime. The mob itself was also changing. The generation that Adonis had been part of, the men who'd created the modern mafia in the early 1930s, was aging out. Some had died, some were in prison. Some, like Adonis, were in exile. A new generation was taking over, and they often lacked the sophistication and discipline of their predecessors. Internal conflicts were becoming more common and more violent. The careful structure that Luciano had created, the commission system designed to prevent wars, was breaking down. Families fought with each other. Bosses were assassinated. The stability of the 1940s and early 1950s was giving way to chaos. The mob's infiltration of legitimate business was also being exposed and attacked. Labor racketeering, which had been so profitable for so long, was being targeted by federal prosecutors. Unions that had been controlled by organized crime were being cleaned up, sometimes through federal oversight. Gambling, long a mob staple, was facing new competition as states began legalizing various forms of gambling. Why risk illegal gambling when you could play the state lottery or go to a legal casino? The mob's gambling operations remained profitable, but the easy money of the old days was diminishing. For Joe Adonis, watching all this from Milan, it must have been both vindication and heartbreak. Vindication because the system he'd helped build had been extraordinary while it lasted. Heartbreak because he could see it crumbling and could do nothing to stop it. In his exile, with nothing but time, Joe Adonis surely reflected on the life he'd lived. He'd been born Giuseppe Antonio Dodo. A poor immigrant boy from a small Italian village, he'd become Joe Adonis, one of the most powerful gangsters in America. That trajectory, from absolute poverty to significant wealth and power, was itself remarkable. He'd helped create the modern American Mafia. He'd been in the room when crucial decisions were made. He'd participated in the murder of Joe Masiria, one of the pivotal moments in organized crime history. He'd sat on the commission, not officially, but in practice, as one of the key advisors and power brokers. He'd built an empire that spanned Brooklyn and New Jersey and touched operations nationwide. He'd also never been convicted of murder, never been convicted of racketeering, never spent significant time in prison until his gambling conviction in his 50s. He'd been, in that sense, extraordinarily successful. He'd committed crimes for decades and had almost entirely avoided the consequences. But in the end, he'd lost. The American government, through a combination of criminal prosecution and deportation, had removed him from everything he'd built. He'd been exiled, cut off, diminished to irrelevance. All his wealth, all his power, all his careful planning, it hadn't been enough to prevent his ultimate defeat. Did he have regrets? We can only guess. He'd certainly chosen a life of crime consciously. Repeatedly, over decades, he'd benefited enormously from that choice. Wealth, power, respect or fear from his community. But he'd also paid a price. Friends and associates killed, years in prison, and ultimately exiled from the only country he'd ever really known. Perhaps in his quiet moments in Milan, he allowed himself to wonder what might have been if he'd chosen differently. If he'd taken his intelligence, his charm, his business skills, and applied them to legitimate businesses, could he have been successful? Almost certainly. Could he have been as powerful? Probably not. Could he have been as wealthy? Maybe, maybe not, but he'd be free in America, surrounded by family and the world he knew. But Joe Adonis had made his choice long ago on the streets of Brooklyn. When he decided that the criminal path offered more than the legitimate one, he'd lived with that choice, prospered from it, and ultimately been destroyed by it, and now in exile. He had to live with the consequences through the 1960s. Joe Adonis gradually faded from public consciousness. Newspapers that had once covered his every move no longer mentioned him. The Kefauver Committee hearings, where his testimony had been broadcast to millions, became a historical footnote. New gangsters captured public attention, and the old names like Adonis and Costello were forgotten, except by historians and true crime enthusiasts. Adonis himself seemed to shrink into his exile. He moved from Milan to other Italian cities, eventually settling in Ancona, a port city on Italy's Adriatic coast. It was quieter than Milan, less cosmopolitan, but perhaps more peaceful for an aging exile. His health began to decline. The years of stress, the rich food, the cigars, the drinking, all of it took its toll. He developed heart problems. He slowed down, spending more time in his apartment, less time walking the streets. He was in his 60s now, an age when many men of his generation were retiring, enjoying grandchildren. Looking back on lives lived, Adonis looked back too. But his memories must have been more complex, more tinged with violence and regret. He maintained some contact with the world he'd left behind. Old associates who were also in exile would visit occasionally. There may have been secret visits from American criminals who had business in Europe. But these contacts grew rarer as the years passed and as the American mob that Adonis had known continued to evolve away from the organization he'd helped create. Imagine Joe Adonis in those final years, sitting in an apartment in Ancona, looking out at the Adriatic Sea. He'd crossed the Atlantic as a child, heading toward the promise of America. He'd crossed it again as an old man, forced back to the country of his birth. In between those two crossings, he'd lived an extraordinary life. He'd known power that most people could never imagine. He'd controlled operations worth millions. He'd sat at tables with the most powerful criminals in America and held his own. He'd accumulated wealth that should have secured his future. But here he was, alone in Italy, cut off from everything that had given his life meaning. The empire he'd built was being run by others. The friends he'd made were dead, in prison or back in America where he couldn't go. The family he'd had was far away, separated from him by deportation. The handsome face that had earned him his nickname was older now, lined with age and stress. The carefully tailored suits still fit perfectly, but they were worn by an old man with nowhere important to go. The charm that had opened doors and smoothed difficult situations was wasted on a lonely exile who had no one to charm. He'd been Giuseppe Antonio Dodo, then Joe Adonis, and now he was something in between, neither fully the immigrant child nor the powerful gangster. Just an old man with a complicated past, waiting for the end. By 1971, Joe Adonis's health had seriously deteriorated. The heart problems that had plagued him for years were getting worse. He was nearly 70 years old, and the years were catching up to him. He spent most of his time in his apartment now. Walking was difficult, his energy was limited. He required medical care, and while he could afford good doctors, there was only so much they could do for an aging body worn down by decades of stress and excess. Friends and acquaintances from the Italian mob community would visit occasionally, paying respects to an old American gangster who'd once been powerful. But these visits were duty more than friendship. Adonis was from a different era, a different world. The young Italian criminals of the 1970s had their own concerns, their own operations. An exiled American gangster in his 70s wasn't particularly relevant to them. Adonis must have known the end was approaching. Perhaps he made peace with it. Perhaps he fought against it. Perhaps he simply accepted it with the stoic pragmatism that had characterized so much of his life. On the day after Thanksgiving in America, November 26, 1971, Joe Adonis died in Ancona, Italy. He was 68 years old, though some records list him as 69 due to confusion about his exact birth date. The cause of death was reported as heart failure. His weakened heart had finally given out. He died in relative obscurity, in a country that had never really been his home, far from the streets of Brooklyn where he'd built his empire. There was no spectacular mob funeral, no procession of black cars stretching for blocks, no hundreds of mourners paying their respects. Those kinds of funerals happened in America for criminals who died on American soil. Adonis's funeral was small, attended by a handful of people who'd known him in his exile years, and perhaps a few representatives from the Italian mob community. His death was noted in American newspapers, but mostly in brief obituaries buried in the back pages. The New York Times ran a short notice. Former gangster Joe Adonis had died in Italy. Some papers included a brief summary of his career, his role in organized crime, his testimony before the Kefauver Committee, his deportation, but there was no extensive coverage, no detailed retrospectives. He'd been out of America for 15 years, and the world had moved on. Joe Adonis left behind a complex legacy, both in the criminal underworld and in American history more broadly. In organized crime, Adonis was one of the key architects of the modern American Mafia, along with Lucky Luciano, Meyer Lansky, Frank Costello, and others. He helped transform organized crime from a chaotic collection of feuding gangs into a structured, business-like enterprise, the commission system. The National Crime Syndicate. The coordination between different ethnic criminal groups. These innovations revolutionized organized crime and made it far more powerful and profitable than it had been under the old Mustache Pete leadership. His control of the Brooklyn waterfront established a model for labor racketeering that would be copied in other cities and industries. His success in cultivating political connections and maintaining a veneer of legitimacy showed other criminals how to operate with relative impunity. But Adonis's deportation and exile also demonstrated the limits of mob power. Despite all his wealth, despite all his connections, despite decades of successfully avoiding serious consequences, the government ultimately defeated him. This sent a message to other criminals. You might win for decades, but eventually the government has tools, like deportation, that can destroy you even if you've avoided criminal conviction in law enforcement. Adonis's case was used as an example of how deportation could be a powerful tool against organized crime figures. If you couldn't get a conviction for racketeering or murder, you could potentially deport them on immigration violations. This strategy would be used against numerous other criminals in subsequent years. His testimony before the Kefauver Committee, broadcast on live television, also had a lasting impact. It was one of the first times millions of Americans saw real criminals testifying, saw them invoking the Fifth Amendment, saw the reality of organized crime. This helped build public support for stronger anti-organized crime measures in American culture. Joe Adonis became part of the mythology of the American Mafia, the handsome gangster, the man who controlled the waterfront, the sophisticated criminal who wore expensive suits and ran restaurants while ordering hits. He appeared in books, was referenced in movies, and became one of the iconic figures of the mob's golden age. His nickname alone, Joe Adonis, captured something essential about the American mob at its peak. These weren't just thugs and killers, they were men who cultivated images, who understood the power of reputation and appearance. They were criminals, yes, but criminals who aspired to something more than simple brutality. In a world of violent, chaotic gangsters, Joe Adonis stood out for several reasons. Intelligence. Adonis was smart, genuinely smart, not just street smart. He understood complex business operations. He could see long-term implications of decisions. He knew when to act and when to wait. This intelligence kept him out of prison for decades and helped him build a more sustainable criminal empire than many of his contemporaries. Self-control. Many gangsters were hot-headed, quick to violence, prone to making emotional decisions. Adonis was controlled, calculating, methodical. He used violence when necessary, but he didn't use it impulsively. This self-control made him more effective and less vulnerable to the kinds of mistakes that destroyed other criminals. Political acumen. Adonis understood that long-term success in organized crime required political protection. He invested in corruption, cultivated relationships with politicians and law enforcement, and understood the importance of operating in the gray areas where criminal and legitimate business intersected. Appearance and charm. His nickname wasn't ironic. Adonis really was remarkably handsome, and he used that to his advantage. He could be charming when he needed to be. He could present himself as a legitimate businessman rather than a thug. This made him more effective in dealing with the legitimate world and helped him maintain his veneer of respectability. Loyalty. Throughout his career, Adonis was notably loyal to his friends and allies, particularly Lucky Luciano, in a world where betrayal was common. Where criminals routinely turned on each other, Adonis's loyalty was distinctive. It earned him trust and respect that served him well. But these same qualities also had their downsides. His intelligence sometimes made him overconfident. His self-control could look like coldness. His political connections created vulnerabilities when those connections were exposed. His loyalty sometimes bound him to allies whose problems became his problems. Joe Adonis mentored and influenced numerous younger criminals who would go on to significant careers in organized crime. While he wasn't an official boss with a formal family, his influence spread through his operations and his associates. Many of the men who worked on the Brooklyn waterfront under Adonis's control learned their criminal craft from him or his organization. They learned about labor racketeering, about gambling operations, about how to cultivate political protection, about how to maintain a legitimate facade. His partnership with Frank Costello also influenced how organized crime operated. The Costello-Adonis model, sophisticated, politically connected, operating in gray areas, became a template for successful mob operations. Even in his absence, after his deportation, the structures he'd helped create continued to influence organized crime. The commission system, the National Crime Syndicate, the integration of criminal and legitimate business. These innovations outlasted their creators. There's a profound irony in Joe Adonis's life story. He immigrated to America as a small child, escaping poverty in rural Italy for the opportunities of the New World. He succeeded beyond anything his parents could have imagined, accumulating wealth, power, and influence that would have been impossible in Montemerano. But in the end, he was forced to return to Italy, to the country he'd left, to die in the kind of obscurity that he'd spent his entire American life trying to escape. The promise of America, that you could become anything, that you could build something from nothing, had been both fulfilled and betrayed in his life. He'd become something extraordinary, but what he'd become ultimately destroyed him. The skills that made him successful, the intelligence, the ruthlessness, the willingness to operate outside the law, these same skills made him a target for deportation. And so Giuseppe Antonio Dodo, who became Joe Adonis, who became one of the most powerful gangsters in America, ended his life as Giuseppe Antonio Dodo again, an old Italian man dying in Italy. His American identity stripped away by the same government whose laws he'd spent his life avoiding. How should we understand Joe Adonis's life? It's tempting to romanticize mob figures, to focus on their charisma and power, and to downplay the reality of what they did. Popular culture often portrays gangsters as anti-heroes, rebels against an oppressive system, or, at worst, criminals who only hurt other criminals. But the reality is more complicated and darker. Joe Adonis built his fortune through exploitation, violence, and corruption. The gambling operations he ran destroyed families and lives. The labor racketeering he engaged in hurt workers and legitimate businesses. The political corruption he facilitated undermined democratic governance. The violence he ordered or participated in killed people. Yes, he was intelligent, charismatic, and loyal to his friends. Yes, he built something extraordinary from a starting point of poverty and disadvantage. Yes, his life story has elements of the American dream, the immigrant who succeeds through determination and skill. But he succeeded through crime. The empire he built was built on suffering. The wealth he accumulated came from exploitation. The power he wielded was used to protect criminal operations and corrupt the political system. His deportation and exile weren't tragedies. They were consequences. Not consequences that he faced for his worst crimes, unfortunately. He was never prosecuted for murder, never convicted of racketeering, never truly faced justice for the full scope of his criminal activities. But he did ultimately face some consequences. And those consequences ended his criminal career and his American life. Today, Joe Adonis is largely forgotten, except by true crime enthusiasts and historians of organized crime. He doesn't have the name recognition of Al Capone or the mythic status of Lucky Luciano. He's not portrayed in major movies or television series the way some other gangsters are. Perhaps this obscurity is appropriate. Adonis spent much of his career trying to avoid publicity, to operate in the shadows, to maintain plausible deniability. That he ended up largely forgotten, despite his significant role in organized crime history, might be what he would have wanted. But his story is worth remembering, not to glorify him, but to understand an important period in American history, the rise of the American Mafia in the early 20th century, its golden age in the 1930s and 1940s, and its gradual decline starting in the 1950s. Joe Adonis was there for all of it. He helped shape it, benefited from it, and ultimately was destroyed by the forces that eventually broke the mob's power. His story is also a reminder that crime doesn't pay. At least not forever. For decades, Adonis seemed untouchable. He accumulated wealth and power while avoiding the consequences that destroyed many of his contemporaries. But in the end, he lost everything that mattered to him. He died in exile alone, cut off from the empire he'd built. And his empire didn't last. The mob operations he'd controlled were taken over by others, then gradually dismantled by law enforcement. The political connections he'd cultivated were exposed and destroyed. The legitimate businesses he'd built fell apart or were sold off. Within a generation of his death, much of what he'd built was gone. Joe Adonis's life spanned a crucial period in American history. From the wave of Italian immigration in the early 20th century through Prohibition, the Great Depression, World War II, the prosperity of the post-war era, and into the social upheavals of the 1960s. His career in organized crime was made possible by specific historical circumstances: the demand for illegal alcohol during Prohibition, the corruption that pervaded many American cities, the limited capabilities of law enforcement, the public's tolerance or ignorance of organized crime, and the opportunities for criminal entrepreneurs in a rapidly changing society. As these circumstances changed as Prohibition ended, as law enforcement became more sophisticated, as public tolerance for corruption decreased, as federal authorities turned their attention to organized crime, the mob's power diminished. Adonis's deportation was part of this larger trend. His life also reflects the complicated story of Italian-American immigration. Millions of Italians came to America seeking better lives. Most worked hard, built legitimate businesses, raised families, and contributed positively to American society. But a small minority turned to crime, and their actions helped create negative stereotypes about Italian Americans that persist to this day. Joe Adonis was one of those who chose crime. His choice had consequences, not just for him personally, but for the broader Italian-American community that had to deal with the stigma that mob activities created. It's impossible not to wonder what Joe Adonis might have accomplished if he'd applied his considerable talents to legitimate pursuits. He was intelligent, charismatic, hardworking, and ambitious, qualities that could have led to success in many fields. He demonstrated business acumen through his legitimate enterprises, like his restaurant. He showed he could manage complex operations through his criminal activities. He proved he could cultivate relationships with powerful people through his political connections. Could he have been a successful legitimate businessman? Almost certainly. Could he have achieved the same level of wealth and power? Probably not, at least not as quickly. And therein lies the trap that caught Adonis and so many others like him. Crime offered faster rewards, higher profits, and more power than most legitimate opportunities available to a poor immigrant kid in early 20th century Brooklyn. The legitimate path would have been harder, slower, less exciting. And when you're young and ambitious and growing up in an environment where criminal success seems not only possible but admirable, the criminal path can seem like this smart choice. But the young Joe Adonis couldn't see what the old Joe Adonis would learn, that the criminal path, no matter how successful it seems, almost always ends badly. Prison, death, or exile, those were the usual outcomes for career criminals. Adonis avoided the first two for decades, but ultimately couldn't avoid the third. Joe Adonis's death in 1971 came at a time when the mob he'd helped create was entering a new and more difficult phase. The golden age was over. The relative peace and prosperity that the commission system had created was breaking down. Internal wars were becoming more common, Law enforcement pressure was intensifying. In many ways, Adonis was lucky to die when he did. He'd already lost his empire, already been exiled, already seen the world he'd known crumble. Had he lived another decade or two, he would have seen things get even worse for the mob. The RICO Act prosecutions that would devastate organized crime, the wave of informants who would betray their former associates, the complete breakdown of omerta, the code of silence that had protected the mob for generations. He died still believing in the old code, still loyal to the organization he'd helped build, still maintaining the facade of the sophisticated gangster, even in exile. Perhaps it's better that he didn't live to see how thoroughly that world would be destroyed in the decades after his death. As we come to the end of Joe Adonis's story, we find ourselves standing at the crossroads of history and humanity, looking back across nearly 7 decades of one man's extraordinary journey through the American underworld. It's a journey that began in the dusty hills of southern Italy and ended in quiet obscurity on those same shores. Having traversed the entire landscape of 20th century organized crime in between, Giuseppe Antonio Dodo was born into grinding poverty in the small village of Montemerano, Italy, in 1902. The world he entered was one of limited opportunities, of ancient hierarchies, of lives predetermined by birth and circumstance, his family. Like millions of others during that great wave of immigration, looked across the Atlantic Ocean and saw something different: America. The land of opportunity, the place where a man could reinvent himself, where the old rules didn't apply, where anything was possible, and they were right, in a way. Young Giuseppe did reinvent himself. He became Joe Adonis, shedding his birth name like an old coat and adopting a persona that would carry him to the highest levels of American organized crime. But the opportunities he seized weren't the ones his parents had imagined when they boarded that ship to Ellis Island. Instead of building a legitimate life through hard work and honest enterprise, he chose crime, and through a potent combination of intelligence, ruthlessness, personal charm, strategic thinking, and more than a little luck, he became one of the most powerful gangsters in America. Think about that transformation for a moment. A child immigrant from a village most Americans couldn't find on a map became a man who controlled the Brooklyn waterfront, who influenced politicians, who sat at the table when the commission made decisions that affected organized crime across the entire nation. He went from having nothing to having everything: wealth, power, respect, fear. He dined with celebrities, paid off judges, ran gambling empires, and never seemed to face consequences for any of it. For decades, nearly 4 decades, he seemed to have beaten the system entirely. While other criminals were gunned down in barber shops and restaurants, Adonis walked freely through the streets of Brooklyn. While other gangsters were hauled off to prison for long sentences, Adonis slept in his own bed. While other criminals faced the justice system's full weight, Adonis seemed somehow immune, protected by layers of legitimate business fronts, by careful planning, by political connections, by sheer cleverness. His nickname, Joe Adonis, after the Greek god of beauty and desire, seemed perfectly appropriate. He looked the part of the successful, sophisticated gangster: handsome, well-dressed, charming when he needed to be, commanding when necessary. He ran a popular restaurant where he played the genial host. He maintained a family life alongside his criminal enterprises. He presented himself as a successful businessman, an immigrant success story, a man who'd made something of himself in America. There's something almost Shakespearean about Joe Adonis's life arc when you step back and look at it whole. The immigrant boy who becomes a prince of the underworld, who tastes power and wealth and success, who seems invincible, who believes he's smarter than everyone else, who thinks he's found a way to beat the system, and then loses everything. Not in one dramatic moment, but gradually, inexorably, watching helplessly as his empire crumbles, and he's cast out from the only world he ever knew. as we reflect on Joe Adonis's complete life story. From that small Italian village to the heights of American organized crime to lonely exile and death, what stands out to you? What aspects of this 70-year journey capture your imagination or challenge your assumptions? Perhaps it's how close he came to succeeding completely for nearly 40 years. He operated at the highest levels of organized crime without facing any serious consequences. He helped found the Commission. He controlled significant criminal enterprises. He influenced politics. He lived well. And he did it all while avoiding the fate that claimed so many of his contemporaries. He wasn't killed by rivals. He wasn't imprisoned for decades. He wasn't broken by the law for a very long time. Joe Adonis appeared to have figured out the secret to being a successful gangster. Stay smart. Stay careful, stay connected, and you can have it all. Or perhaps what surprises you is how thoroughly he lost everything in the end. Despite all that wealth and power and careful planning, all his caution, all his strategic thinking, all his political connections, none of it could save him from deportation. None of it could prevent the government from taking away everything that mattered to him. All the money in the world couldn't buy him the one thing he truly wanted: to stay in America, to continue running his operations, to remain relevant and powerful. How do we reconcile those contradictions? How do we understand a man who could be both those things simultaneously? The easy answer is that we don't. That we simply acknowledge that human beings are complicated and contain multitudes and can't be reduced to simple categories of good and evil. But that answer, while true, doesn't quite capture the specific tragedy of Joe Adonis's life. Because here's what's ultimately tragic about his story. Giuseppe Antonio Dodo had genuine talents. He was intelligent, strategic, personable, capable of managing complex operations and building organizations. In a different life, with different choices, those talents might have built something legitimate and lasting. He might have been a successful businessman, a community leader, someone who made a positive contribution to society. But instead, he chose crime, and that choice made when he was young, made in the context of his time and circumstances, made for reasons we can understand even if we can't condone. That choice determined everything that followed. It brought him wealth and power, yes, but it also ensured that everything he built was temporary, illegitimate, destined to collapse eventually. You can't build a lasting legacy on crime, no matter how smart you are. Thank you for staying with me through this complete journey through Joe Adonis's life. From the streets of Brooklyn to the heights of organized crime to exile in Italy, we've followed every verified detail of his remarkable and troubling life. We've traced the arc from immigrant poverty to criminal empire to lonely exile, seeing how one man's choices reverberated across decades and shaped American organized crime. What surprised you most about Joe Adonis's story? Was it his role in founding the Commission? His decades of avoiding prosecution? The irony of his deportation? The loneliness of his final years? What aspects of his life, or the era he lived in, fascinated you most? I genuinely want to know your perspectives on this historical figure. So please drop your thoughts in the comments below. These discussions often reveal insights I hadn't considered, and I love reading different takes on these complicated lives. If you enjoyed this deep dive into true crime history, please subscribe to the channel. Hit that notification bell so you don't miss future episodes where we'll explore more stories from the golden age of organized crime and beyond. And please share this video with anyone who appreciates detailed, well-researched true crime content. These long-form explorations take considerable time and research, and your support through subscriptions, likes, and shares makes them possible. For those of you settling in for the night, I hope Joe Adonis's story gave you something to think about as you drift off to sleep. The rise and fall of the beautiful gangster, it's a very American story in its way. Both inspiring and cautionary, both fascinating and tragic. It reminds us that choices have consequences, that power is more fragile than it appears, and that you can't build a lasting legacy on crime and corruption, no matter how smart or careful you are. Sweet dreams, everyone, and remember, the choices we make define us. And sometimes those choices echo across decades, shaping our destinies in ways we can't always foresee. Giuseppe Antonio Dodo chose to become Joe Adonis, and that choice brought him everything he wanted for a while, and then took it all away. His story is over now, ended in an Italian town far from the Brooklyn streets where it began. But the lessons remain. Sleep well, and I'll see you in the next story.